Martin Luther King Day event, a conversation with Veterans for Peace.
Welcome. This is the What We Have Forgotten, Martin Luther King and Militarism. It'll be about Dr. King's stand on militarism, which a lot of people haven't heard about and which he got a lot of flack about, so we'll talk about that. We're, as you said, members of Veterans for Peace, local chapter. I'm a Vietnam veteran from the Army. Bob was in the Navy. Bill was a Marine. We have Charlie Picard, who was in the Air Force. And we have an associate member, Lynn Gilbert, who's very important to us because, among other things, she takes the minutes. Helps us out that way. Just want to read you a little bit about Veterans for Peace so you know what we're all about. Statement of purpose. We, having been in the military, do hereby affirm our greater responsibility to serve the cause of world peace. To this end, we will work with others toward increasing public awareness of the costs of war, to restrain our government from intervening in the internal affairs of other nations, to end the arms race and reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons, to seek justice for veterans and victims of war, and to abolish war as an instrument of national policy. So that's where we are, and I'm going to turn it over to Bob and get into the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Anyway, when people ask me about Veterans for Peace, my quick elevator story would be, it's a group of veterans that, and some of them have been in combat, that say there's got to be a better way to solve conflict than running off to wars all the time, and especially wars created by people in politics that have never served in the military to begin with. And are we anti-military? No, we're not. We don't hate the military. It'd be like saying you hate yourself. But are we all pacifists? Some are, some aren't. If a lot of members said if would be a legitimate war, that they would, pitch in. But we got a good mix of everybody in there. With our chapter here in the local area, one thing that we do that we're very happy with is a peace scholarship program, where we give scholarships anywhere from say a couple $100 up to $5,000, and these go to students that are enrolled in collegiate level peace studies or conflict resolution courses. And to help support that, we have the John Lennon birthday concert every October at the Ark. And just a short story on that, too. When we were first setting this up, we wanted to get John Lennon's widow, Yoko Ono's, permission that we weren't doing anything they didn't want us to. So we sent her a letter saying, we're not asking for any money, we're not asking for anything. Is this okay that we just do this so we can raise money for our peace scholarships? And got a letter back from her lawyer asking about if we were a 501c3 organization, which we are. And a few weeks later, lo and behold, we get a check from Yoko Ono for $10,000. That was our setup, our seed money to get this peace scholarship program going. So yeah, we're real happy about that. Another thing that we do every Memorial Day and Veterans Day is Arlington, Michigan is one grave marker for every Michigan soldier killed in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. It's like right now about 230, and it's a one grave marker for every like I said, Michigan soldier killed from Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's meant to be a solemn display, not political. And, as they say, there's two deaths in everybody's life. The one death is when you physically die. The second is when you're completely forgotten by everybody else on the world. And we, hope to keep, their memories alive through the display. And also we have over at Leslie Science Center, we're usually there for Earth Day, as if there is any calamity to the environment greater than nuclear war, we don't know what it is. So we're trying to bring that point home. But the title of the talk today is What We Have Forgotten: Martin Luther King and Militarism. Martin Luther King Day has evolved to the point where there's there's, well, when you take into account the three triplets that Martin Luther King talked about, racism, poverty, and militarism. And, on Martin Luther King Day, there's a lot of programs, a lot of presentations on racism, which is needed. Absolutely, positively, yes. But there's less on poverty. You don't hear too many talks about Martin Luther King and poverty. There's almost nothing on Martin Luther King's teachings and statements on war and militarism. Why? Because it's almost scary what he's talking about to a lot of people, and they don't want to think about it, or they don't want this to be brought up in public. And there's some other things too, but just getting around to MLK and militarism before I turn it over to Bill. What is militarism? One definition is it regards military efficiency as a supreme ideal of the state to place all other interests of the country below those of the military. It's like, okay, what agency in the government never gets their funds cut? If anything, they get them increased. It's always the Department of Defense. We've seen it over and over and over again, where let's say the Department of Defense asks for so much money, and then Congress gives them that and plus much more, and they never run out. They always then want more money, more. It never ends. So, and when you start having a massive military budget, well, where does that money come out of? It comes mainly out of social funds, such as education and health care and so on. So you trade off one for the other. Also, militarism can be the belief or desire of a government or people that a country should maintain a strong military capability and not be afraid to use it to defend or promote their national interests. That can be a very dangerous train of thought when we're saying we're going to prove our mettle not through diplomacy and talking, but we're going to prove it by how much might we have. It's like you get in an argument with your neighbor and all of a sudden you get out guns and start shooting at each other rather than talking a problem through. It's really dangerous, but militarism also can be an ideology that claims that the military is the foundation of society's security and therefore its most important aspect. Goes along with what we just, the other point above. And it can be the glorification or prevalence of a military spirit, attitudes in a nation, or the predominance of a military caste in government. Where you see this a lot is, you hear some people say, well, every soldier that's in the military is a hero, and like they can do no wrong. And that can be leading to a very dangerous situation because nobody then is responsible for their actions, so to speak. The military, if you've never been in, it's like a microcosm of society in general. You got great noble people that stick to the rules, but then also at the other end, you've got people that could care less, and they shouldn't have ever gone in the military. Soldiers are people just like everybody else. They're human. They have their great things. They have their flaws too. And also, last thing, militarism can be a predominance of the armed forces in the administration or policy of the state. We got in our Constitution that the military is controlled by a civilian government, not the other way around. And we've all seen nations around the world where they go from a democracy to basically a military junta, and lots of times, we're going to go back to a democracy. Well, it's kind of hard to do that once you made the one step of being a military state. So. Just one thing more before I turn this over to Bill on unrestrained militarism and what's really going on. Let me just read a quote here, and if you've never heard it before, you might want to imagine who this would be coming from. The person goes, "War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one. International in scope, it is the only one which profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses of lives. And this is not coming from some wild anti-war protester. It comes from Major General of the Marine Corps, Smedley Butler. He had the highest rank authorized at the time when he was in. At his death in 1940, he was the most decorated Marine in U.S. history. He's one of 19 members of the military to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor twice. So here, this guy as telling us war is a racket, and what he said back in the 30s and 40s is, fortunately true to this day yet. So with that in mind, then, I'll turn this over to Bill.
Does this work there? I hesitate to use a hand mic because as soon as I do, I break into karaoke. So please bear with me. What we have forgotten, MLK and militarism. First thing I'd like to add about militarism is it's more than looking at the military influence in American culture, the idea that it's part of using the military in global confrontations, this and that. Militarism is also locally in our police department. When you see a Humvee going down the street run by police officers, that's militarism. So when we're talking about issues here about what the military does, it has an influence on us daily right here on a local level. It's not some abstract thing where you're in the military and that's separate from what we are. So we keep this in mind. The portion I'd like to talk about today will be giving a little bit of history of MLK, and that leads up to two very important speeches that he gave in January 1967 that dealt explicitly with militarism and the response to those comments and how Martin Luther King went beyond that and went from there. Before I get started, I'd like to mention a couple of things. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was formed in 1957. Primarily, that was put together as an organization to lead the civil rights movement, but also an organization where the money went. They hustled money all the time, and that was the money organization for the group. In 1960, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was formed by a bunch of college students that primarily their function at that point in time was to organize sit-ins at diners, that kind of stuff. And King at that point in time saw them as kind of a junior organization to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So as the relationship between those changed, it had an impact on King as well. When we look for the idea of militarism in King's writings and speeches, the first major one, and it really wasn't, he didn't really dwell on the topic, but was in 1964 when he won the Nobel Prize. He made a comment at that time. I need this. King said at the Nobel Prize lecture on December 11th, 1964, "All that I have said boils down to the conclusion that man's survival is dependent upon man's ability to solve the problems of racial injustice, poverty, and war." Those three things against racism, materialism, and militarism in 1964. In 1965, when he was in Selma, this is after the letter from Birmingham jail, after him being arrested in Atlanta, in 1965, he made a statement in Selma, again, about the three evils at that point in time. In 66, things happened in American culture in 1966 that King was involved with. Primarily, a lot of the actions in the 64, 65 was done in the South. Selma, Alabama, Atlanta, Chattanooga, other places in the South. And by the time we got to 1966, it was the Southern Christian Leadership Foundation was going to go up north and address some of the issues up north. And they went to Chicago primarily to dwell on two things. One, open housing was a big issue at that point in time. And another one was Jesse Jackson's bread basket. I'm sorry, I can't remember what it was called. But what he did, Jesse Jackson did some amazing things. Got businesses to open up their shop to hire more and more African Americans to spread the wealth, so to speak. It was very successful. But there was problems going on, both in the Southern Christian Leadership Foundation. The organization was really getting scattered, and there was a real conflict between the Southerners coming up to Chicago, thinking that they could run everything up in Chicago, just like they ran it down in the South. So there were some real dynamic problems going on in Chicago. Things didn't work out too well there. And of course, everybody pointed their finger at King, because it was his idea to send them up there and going like this. It was some people in his organization said that was a mistake to think that we Southerners could come up to the North and handle this. And but King was under some immense pressure during the late 1966. By Christmas of 1966, he had had enough. Not totally enough, but he needed a break. He needed a break. He needed a vacation to rethink things, to write a book, to really get things in order there. And over Christmas break at that time, the Nation magazine said, "Why don't you come out in February to or give us a speech in February?" And he thought about it, and he said, "I'm going on vacation." Now, he went to Jamaica, which was a good spot, but he also did a wise thing down in Jamaica. He didn't take a telephone. So he was there taking care of business by himself. And while he was there, he saw a magazine, Ramparts magazine, that had a interesting pictorial edition. It was called The Children of Vietnam. And in it were these pictures of a mother with her dead baby, burned children. All these things happened because of bombing from above, mortars, things like that. The children of Vietnam were being devastated here. And this triggered King. He said he could no longer talk about civil rights without addressing the issue of Vietnam. And so when he got back to the States, he started to sit down to write a speech, and he gave the speech in January 25th out in LA, and it was called The Casualties of the War in Vietnam. Now, basically, when we look at this, and I'll give you a few excerpts here in a minute, when you look at this speech, The Casualties of War in Vietnam, he starts his essay by laying out some of the problems that a Vietnam War caused him to think about where his position is on the issue. But the more we listen to this, we find subtly the rhetoric changes from looking at Vietnam to really kind of looking at war in general, about what are the casualties of war. And so I'll play you a few excerpts, short excerpts of this, and see what we think.
And I have chosen as a subject from which to speak the casualties of the war in Vietnam. We are certainly all aware of the nightmarish physical casualties of this war. We see them in our living rooms and all of their tragic dimensions on television screens. We see grief-stricken mothers with crying babies. Most tragic of all is the casualty list among children. It is estimated that some 1 million Vietnamese children have been casualties of this brutal war. But the physical casualties of the war in Vietnam are not alone the catastrophe. One of the first casualties of the war in Vietnam was the Charter of the United Nations. In taking armed action against the Viet Cong and North Vietnam, the United States clearly violated the UN Charter, which provides in Chapter 1, Article 2, that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. The second casualty of the war in Vietnam is the principle of self-determination. By entering a war that is little more than a domestic civil war, America has ended up supporting a new form of colonialism covered up by certain niceties of complexity. Whether we realize it or not, our participation in the war in Vietnam is an ominous expression of our lack of sympathy for the oppressed, our paranoid anti-communism, our failure to feel the ache and anguish of the have-nots. A third casualty of the war in Vietnam is a great society. This confused war has played havoc with our domestic destinies. Despite feeble protestations to the contrary, the promises of the great society have been shot down on the battlefields of Vietnam. The pursuit of this widened war has narrowed domestic welfare programs, making the poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home. A fourth casualty of the war in Vietnam is the humility of our nation. America has become the richest and most powerful nation in the world. But honesty impels me to admit that our power has often made us arrogant as a nation. We feel that our money can do anything. We are arrogant in professing to be concerned about the freedom of foreign nations while not setting our own house in order. Many of our senators and congressmen vote joyously to appropriate billions of dollars for war in Vietnam. And these same senators and congressmen vote loudly against a fair housing bill to make it possible for a Negro veteran of Vietnam to purchase a decent home. All of this reveals that our nation has not yet used its vast resources of power to end the long night of poverty, racism, and man's inhumanity to man. A fifth casualty of the war in Vietnam is the principle of dissent. An ugly, repressive sentiment to silence peace seekers depicts advocates of immediate negotiation under terms of the Geneva Agreement and persons who call for the cessation of bombings in the North as quasi-traitors, fools, or venal enemies of our soldiers and institutions. A sixth casualty of the war in Vietnam is the prospects of mankind's survival. This war has created the climate for greater armament and further expansion of destructive nuclear power. Let me say finally that I oppose the war in Vietnam because I love America. I speak out against it not in anger, but with anxiety and sorrow in my heart, and above all with a passionate desire to see our beloved country stand as the moral example of the world. I speak out against this war because I'm disappointed with America. I'm disappointed with our failure to deal positively and forthrightly with the triple evils of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism. We are presently moving down a dead-end road. It is time for all people of conscience to call upon America to return to her true home of brotherhood and peaceful pursuits. We cannot remain silent as our nation engages in one of history's most cruel and senseless wars.
that speech was delivered out in L.A., so it didn't get a lot of press. There wasn't a lot of criticisms about it. Plus the content of it, what are the casualties of war, really weren't that controversial. And you stop and think about it, you look at it, it's the casualties of any war is what he's talking about. But he did get some major flack from his own organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Well, primarily, they said, don't deliver this thing because you'll upset LBJ. LBJ did a lot of work for him in 1964, 65, civil rights movement, thing and that. But they were afraid that if they alienated LBJ, things would go bad. Well, it turns out that King and LBJ had not really had a very good relationship by the time 1967 came around. As noted in there, the open housing thing was voted down. LBJ really wasn't quite delivering what King had hoped he was going to deliver. Another reason is that they felt that if King went to the February 25th meeting or parade or demonstration out there, that it was an open demonstration, so he would be saddled with standing up next to people in the Black Power movement. And all of a sudden, they would be on equal footing if they were both on the same forum. And that would somehow diminish King's power and persuasion within the civil rights movement. A third thing is that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was really in a bad way. They were running out of money. They weren't really well organized. Things were happening, not keeping an eye on it. Some people were running it that didn't know how to run it very well. And it was felt that if King didn't get down to look at this and take care of it, the organization would fail. A fourth thing was that many people felt that it was not a good idea. It would relegate King to a lower status within the civil rights movement, even within the anti-war movement. So all these things, King didn't buy it. He said, I can't get beyond the Rampart magazine about the children of Vietnam. I need to address this issue forthrightly. Now, he was invited to go to New York to another demonstration on April 25th, but before that, he was going to give his second major speech at this point in time at the Riverside Church in New York. It was called Beyond Vietnam. It's an interesting article because it's kind of broken into, the first part is about what made King come to this point. What was it that made him want to talk about Vietnam? The second part, in the middle there, he gives some right-on critique about what needs to be done in America about Vietnam. In the third part, he talks about beyond Vietnam. What is it in American culture that we have to do to become a better country, better moralistic country, and stay away from the idea of militarization? I'll play you some excerpts from that as well.
Since I am a preacher by calling, I suppose it is not surprising that I have 7 major reasons for bringing Vietnam into the field of my moral vision. That is, at the outset, a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. And then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Holland. My third reason moves to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For those who ask the question, aren't you a civil rights leader? And thereby mean to exclude me from the movement for peace, I have this further answer. Now it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. As if the weight of such a commitment to the life and health of America were not enough, another burden of responsibility was placed upon me in 1954. And I cannot forget that the Nobel Peace Prize was also a commission to work harder than I had ever worked before for the brotherhood of man. This is a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances. But even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I am speaking against the war. And finally, as I try to explain for you and for myself the road that leads from Montgomery to this place, I would have offered all that was most valid if I simply said that I must be true to my conviction that I share with all men the calling to be a son of the living God. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy.
Marvelous speaker. Marvelous speaker. Not only does it drag you in and listen to his words, but the logic and of the power of his rhetoric is just amazing. And King finally said something needed to be done. In order to atone for our sins and errors in Vietnam, we should take the initiative in bringing a halt to this tragic war. And he offered 5 solutions. The first one, end all bombing in North and South Vietnam. This is 1967. The war ended in 1975. Number 2, declare a unilateral ceasefire in the hopes that such action will create the atmosphere for negotiations. It took a long time before they got to the table and negotiated in Paris. Long time. 3, take immediate steps to prevent other battlegrounds in Southeast Asia by curtailing our military buildup in Thailand and our interference in Laos. Well, there was almost as many people in Cambodia in 1970 when I was over there as there was in Vietnam. 4, realistically, accept the fact that the National Liberation Front has substantial support in South Vietnam and must thereby play a role in any meaningful negotiations in any future Vietnam government. That was a tough one. That was a tough one there. He said, let everybody participate. The U.S. government was not going to let the Viet Cong in. 5, set a date that we will remove all foreign troops from Vietnam in accordance with the 1954 Geneva Agreement. These are tough words that someone had to be said, and King set up the argument, set up his speech in such a way that these were kind of a natural conclusion. But this speech was called Beyond Vietnam, beyond it. He had something else that needed to be said that was aimed directly at us, not the military people, not the politicians, but us as a country. And that's the last part of this.
The war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. True revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. A true revolution of values will lay hand on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo and unjust mores, and thereby speed the day when every valley shall be exalted and every mountain and hill shall be made low. A genuine revolution of values means, in the final analysis, that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. And if we will only make the right choice, we will be able to transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of peace. If we will make the right choice, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. If we will but make the right choice, we will be able to speed up the day all over America and all over the world, when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And I have chosen as a subject.
It was a great speech, but it didn't go over well with the media people. Didn't go over well. The criticism was scathing. And it's amazing when you look at the criticism, there's pages and pages from places all over the country, Omaha, all over the country, was 9 out of 10 were critical of this stance he took. But the New York Times says King was fusing two public problems that are distinct and separate. After listening to this speech, what? Didn't they listen to it? Didn't they hear it? Did they just have a deadline to meet and go about that way? Washington Post, a reflection of his disappointment at the slow progress of civil rights and the war on poverty. It was filled with bitter and damaging allegations and inferences that did not and could not be documented. I mean, why are you nitpicking about documentation when what he says is absolutely true? The relationship between racism, militarism, and capitalism are intricately connected. are intricately connected because they all deal with this issue of status and all deal with this issue of class. One class is color, one class is materialism, and one class is militarism. And these guys didn't see it. There was one major newspaper that did support him, the Detroit Free Press. Came out and said that he thought it was a reasonable position, and we tend to agree with it. Well, King took all sorts of flack from the news media. He was on the Sunday or Saturday news shows, Meet the Press, where they grilled him about his relationship with Vietnam and civil rights and how he was backing off of civil rights and this and that. And King just was appalled at it. And he was hammered over and over and over again, no matter where he went. And he was really, really, really depressed by all this. He went down to Atlanta in May and was working on a sermon there, and an old buddy of his by the name of Howard Baugh, a former Marine, appeared at King's door at Ebenezer Church. Nice small, beautiful church. And he said, Dr. King, I listened to you last night and tell the multitudes of people that you cannot condone the war in Vietnam, and our people are over there dying. King said, let me tell you something. You've never really given this organization full credit for what it really stands for. It's a nonviolent organization. And when I say nonviolent, I mean nonviolent all the way. Never could I advocate nonviolence in this country and not advocate nonviolence for the whole world. That's my philosophy. I don't believe in the death and killing on any side, no matter who's heading it up, whether it be America or any other country, or whether it be for black folks. Nonviolence is my stand, and I'll die for that stand. Paul said, and at that time I understood for the first time in my life what was meant by nonviolence. So, King went on later in the month to address issues in Cleveland and ultimately make his move down to Memphis. But he never left the idea of the three evils: racism, materialism, and militarism. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I really appreciate that. You know, and what Bill's talking about, you know, just drives it home so much more why even today Martin Luther King's teachings on war and militarism, you don't hear it in the mainstream media, because, you know, Dr. King is saying war is not noble. There are really uncomfortable side effects of war, like PTSD, widows, widowers, lifelong physical problems through military action that soldiers occur. He's saying war promotes hatred, and that war can lead to a spiritual death of a country. And, you know, and you think about who profits the most off of war: military contractors. You know, can you imagine like a Lockheed Martin commercial or a Boeing commercial about, you know, about their military products coming out and saying these things? You know, no, that, you know, we don't want to talk about this. It makes people uncomfortable. But just to wrap up here, you know, getting towards the wrap-up point, you know, just it's been 50 years, over 50 years now since Dr. King was assassinated. You know, how much has changed over that period of time, and, you know, specifically, you know, towards poverty, racism, and war, you know, and the connectedness between the two. Well, in 1968, you know, we had poverty. Well, we got poverty now, but in 68 it was very prevalent. People of color were often the most affected. And, you know, for us, you know, old enough, you know, we can remember, you know, if your family had money and you could get into college, you got a draft deferment. If you didn't, well, guess where you're going, you know, and you're going to probably Vietnam. And, you know, it was, you know, an uneasy balance of, you know, the number of minorities in Vietnam compared to, you know, non-minorities. You know, social programs back in the 60s were, you know, hurt by military expenditures, because you got to pay for it somehow with the bombs and the weapons and such. And it still goes on today. It's one of the most bizarre things. I think I learned when you get into the military. You have a fiscal year of the government. Usually at October 1st or something like that. And you get all this money that was given to the military by Congress. And if you don't use it, you lose it. So, here it comes, October 1st. Everybody's spending things like crazy, buying things, in the military. And because if they don't, they're going to come back, Congress will come back and say, well, you didn't use it last year, so we're not going to give it to you now again. So, it's just feeding on itself. A big misnomer too is when, this feeling of, oh well, we got to raise money, have more funds going to the Pentagon for our defense budget, and it makes it sound like it's all going to go to like the soldiers, and it doesn't. It's mainly going to defense contractors, who make an obscene amount of money, and back in World War II, at least you had somebody like Harry Truman before he became president. He was having war profiteering hearings as he went around the country. You don't hear about that anymore. Profit, well, it's the way we operate. 1968, racism was running rampant, and hatred towards other races is still widely accepted. But especially when racism in war. Because almost every war involves racism in order to make killing more prevalent. How many times have you heard, people spouting out that a certain population doesn't matter, and or worse, they're subhuman, and they're not like us. They don't value life like we do. We still hear things like that, and if you hate someone, it's makes it easier to kill or hurt that person. Because again, you're falling back on this aura of, well, they're not really like us. We look at what happened in World War II with the Holocaust, but have we really learned from that? We had like Cambodia, Rwanda, and in Vietnam too. Our side with My Lai, and My Lai was just not an a single incident. There were little things like that happening all over the country. Why? The Vietnamese, well, they're not like us. Coming back to militarism, in the 60s, it was, still the same thing. We need the Defense Department needs more and more and more. It's never enough. We see that still today, and what's even more dangerous today is still diplomacy losing out to military solutions. You got a problem? Send in the military. But who pays for it in the end? If you go out and say, well, that you don't support military funding, you want more people focused programs like education, healthcare, and such. Well, you're labeled as unpatriotic and not supporting the troops. Again, this money that goes to the Pentagon don't ever think of it always going to the common soldier. It just doesn't. When you're in the military, and about the only thing you would ask if you had to go into combat, that all diplomatic efforts are exhausted before that happens. But, is that the case? Look what happened in Iraq. I mean, made up stories of, weapons of mass destruction, how many people, not only from our country, but, from Iraq died over all that. And we see it happen over and over and over. What happened to our laws, too? When's the last time a war was declared on a country? 1941. But we sent troops into Syria without any qualms whatsoever in other countries. What happens if, the Canadians came over here and occupied us? Would that, be an act of war? But, And well, he didn't even live to see World War I, but there's a great quote: "In the time of war, the loudest patriots are the greatest profiteers." And this is August Bebel, lived until 1913. And going back, 50 years ago, well, okay, we advanced ourselves 50 years. Now it's the year we're living in. Has anything changed dramatically from 1968? One is with the media. If you're old enough, you remember in Vietnam, there weren't anything as like embedded reporters. You had reporters that were just scouring the country, getting the real live news of what was going on. That's how My Lai broke with Sidney Hirsch. And, now the Pentagon has learned its lesson. And instead of, having independent journalists, they say, well, come on, we'll embed you. We'll make you part of the troops. It's sort of almost like making a reporter, that's been covering local government, doing things like, having the government officials say, hey, come on over, I'm having a party, let's go have lunch all the time. Pretty soon you build up that relationship where, well, the reporter might be thinking, well, yeah, this guy did a bad thing, but he's such a nice person, and I don't want to do that. Or, they're not going to like this story in City Hall, so I might not print it. So, embeddedness has its problems. Another thing, is a lot different is, if you don't like a story, just call it fake news. We see that over and over. And the media is the enemy, which is the most disheartening of all. There's that saying, it was mainly during World War II, I wasn't a trade unionist, so when they came for the trade unionists, I didn't say anything. When they came for blah, 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 I didn't say anything. And, there's this one quote going around now that first they came for the reporters, and that's all I know of what happened. And it's the truth. I mean, if you don't have a free press, there's so much hidden that's going on behind the scenes. Drone warfare is another thing. Well, that's what made Vietnam so unpopular. 58,000, of our troops getting killed. Person to person facing each other in Vietnam. But now we get away from that little problem by operating drones, where you have a drone operator that's judge, jury, and executioner. Maybe he'll hit the right people, maybe he won't. Maybe he'll make him or her make a mistake. And I always thought it was kind of a joke that drone operators, like for operating out like Arizona, for instance, could get PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But then I saw the documentary National Bird, which means our new national bird, the drone, and these people had definite PTSD situations going on. So. And, some good things, though, in the past 50 years, social media. It would be inconceivable 50 years ago that, something like what happened on Saturday, on Friday, how many people knew who Nathan Phillips was? You live, a lot of people from maybe around here would know him as an Indian, or I mean, not Indian, I hate using that word, but Native American activists. But on Saturday, once this incident happened in Washington D.C., I mean, it was social media taking this around the world, where by the time 6 o'clock at night, the BBC was covering this. So it's a tremendous tool if used right. And another thing that good we have is really prepared and active activists. And the local example I like to use that is the gerrymandering people. The people are people, not politicians. That grew out of somebody's thought for change, and just cascaded into the point of they were so well prepared that any roadblock that came in their way, they just were already ready for it. And we have that law to put power back in the hands of the people, not politicians, on your right to vote. And just two final quotes. I'm not a religious person, But when it comes to Martin Luther King, it makes me think of like biblical prophets, where when Martin Luther King could the day before he's killed foresee his own killing, is incredible. And I was just reading this a couple weeks ago, another quote he had, and this fits our times perfectly, where Martin Luther King said, "Nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." And what are we going through right now? It's almost like he made those words for us. And not Martin Luther King, but a French philosopher Voltaire said, "Nothing is more dangerous than ignorance and intolerance armed with power." And again, this is really brings everything home. So our words are, again, keep in mind, Martin Luther King's teachings on war and militarism. They're important. He was trying to say a lot of things that were, to a lot of people very radical, and they're to a lot of people very radical today. But educate yourself, and above all, ask questions.
This program was recorded on January 21st, 2019 at the Ann Arbor District Library.